Okay, welcome to the second video on writing. And now we're back at the beginning of the handout. And I'm going to talk through this handout with you guys. And just, you know, these are the rules that I suggest you follow in writing a successful philosophy paper. So rule number one is answer the question. Make sure that your paper includes a direct response to the essay question and all of its parts. So, you know, in the papers so far, the papers that have gotten D's or F's, the reason they've gotten D's or F's is they do not respond to the essay question, or they don't effectively respond to it. There are large parts of the paper that are off topic, and by and large, they have not paid attention. They have not paid attention sufficiently to the essay question. So make sure that you are responding to the essay question and all of its parts. The essay questions are written carefully. They've been crafted over a long period of time. They're crafted so as to direct you to the different parts of the topic that you need to be discussing. And so pay close attention to the essay question. It's gonna give you a lot of clues about what needs to be in your paper. You know, if you were, say, coming up with your own essay topic, which happens in more advanced classes, then you want to make sure that the task you set yourself, that you see all of the different parts of it, right? And that your paper includes a discussion of each of those parts. Okay, so in the opening paragraph, make sure that you introduce the issue and state your thesis. So a good philosophy paper is modest and makes a small point. It makes that point clearly and straightforwardly and offers good reasons to support, good evidence, good reasons, good argumentation in support of the point that it's trying to make. So one thing to note in doing this, that in a way is the cardinal sin of more advanced undergraduate writing. So, you know, when the paper topic is set for you, there's a way in which the topic is fixed, and so it's not, you don't have to choose, and you won't get lost in trying to make a point that is too grand. But I would say the biggest problem with advanced undergraduate writing, especially with students who are sharp and otherwise good writers, is they take on more than they really can handle. And they try to do more than they can do while keeping their topic under control, right? And I don't need to see that you can have big ideas. I hope you're having big ideas. I hope that that's happening. I think that that's one of the primary benefits of philosophy classes. But what I want to see in a paper is that you can keep control of your ideas and develop an argument over a sustained period of time, and really make an effective case, right? I mean, that's what I want to see. That's the skill that I'm looking for in philosophy papers. And so don't pick some huge topic where you're just going to get into hot water because you don't really understand what you're saying. And maybe you can't because the topic is so big that you couldn't possibly cover it in the amount of time that you have. Rather, pick a smaller topic that you can keep control of, where you can make the argument that you're setting out to make in an effective way that convinces me as the reader. But moving on, so you don't need to sell your reader on your topic. And specifically, I mean, this is incredibly common in introductory philosophy classes. Don't use boilerplate phrases like in the opening paragraph, like it's one of the great questions, or from the dawn of time, human beings have wondered, right? Don't say crap like that. I mean, I don't need to be pandered to, right? Like it feels like you're pandering to your reader, and and it doesn't work, right? Like, I just want to know what your argument's going to be. I want to know what your reasoning is, and I want to be able to evaluate that reasoning. And I don't need you to give me some kind of fluff selling me what you're going to say. You know, it's irrelevant. And it just detracts from the overall quality of the paper. So don't use boilerplate. So when I say boilerplate in my comments, that's what I mean. I mean these kind of stock phrases that aren't actually furthering your argument. They're not actually doing any work. And they're just, yeah. I mean, okay. Number 3, define the views you're going to be discussing in your paper, and the important technical terms that you use. So, for example, if you were writing about Descartes or Aristotle, you would want to explain what the imagination is, or what the intellect is, or what judgment is, or what an innate idea is, right? These are all technical terms that have a very specific meaning in either Aristotle or Descartes. And you're an average educated reader, an average intelligent reader, isn't going to know what Descartes or Aristotle in particular means by these terms, right? They have a kind of everyday usage, but Descartes and Aristotle are using them in a much more specific sense than that everyday usage. And that specific sense is important for making the argument, right? If you're just using them in the everyday sense, then you're going to be using them in too vague of a way in order to really make the case that you need to be making. So you need to introduce these technical terms. So you can assume an intelligent reader, but you should think of them as not working in your field. And in general, I mean, I think this is true for all philosophy classes and all philosophy writing. In writing an essay in a philosophy class, you're engaged in a kind of pretense. I mean, I think this is true outside of philosophy too, right? So you're pretending to write a kind of journal article. I mean, it's not really a journal article, but you're sort of adopting the conventions of scholarly writing, and in order to do that, you can assume an intelligent reader that's not working in your field, but you need to introduce technical terms. If you submitted a paper to a journal that had unexplained terms, it would just be rejected. You know, the person refereeing the article, who has to evaluate whether it should be a published paper, would say, I don't know what this term means, and I don't know if the author knows what this term means. And maybe I have an idea of what the term means, but I don't know the author knows what the term means. And so if you don't say what you mean by the terms that are doing special work for you in a paper you want published, it will not get published, right? So define your terms, Rule number 4, make the structure of your paper obvious. The idea here is you should say what you're going to say in the opening of the paper, and then as you're saying it, you should be giving a kind of running commentary on where you are in making your argument, right? So don't ignore your paper, don't ignore your reader. Make your transitions between your paragraphs clear. And one way to do that is in introducing, in the transition into the paragraph, you can say, so in the last paragraph, we saw blah, and now we're ready to see duh, right? So far, we've looked at Aristotle, now we're ready to turn to Descartes. Things like that, right? So you should make the transitions between paragraphs clear, and you should explain where you are in the argument and where you're going. This is often called signposting. So signposting is telling your reader where they are in the argument, where they are in the path that you're leading them along, where they were and where they need to go, and sort of reminding them along the way, right? It's kind of, you're sort of working at a meta level, and you're commenting on what's going on in the arguments that you're making, so as to orient your reader. And that kind of thing is extremely helpful in philosophy papers, because it's so easy to get lost in the overall argument of a paper. Because the arguments are somewhat abstract, right? I mean, it's easy to sort of think, okay, what is this doing again? And if the writer is reminding you throughout the paper what's being done, well, it's much harder to forget what's going on, right? Okay, the next rule is pay attention to your transitions. So we talked about this a little bit before in the method for writing a philosophy paper. So that was, the reading and rereading, right? Where you reread each sentence, paragraph, right? We talked about the transitions there. Now in these rules, this is the same thought. So you don't want your paper to look like one damn sentence after another. How do you avoid this effect? Well, you need to pay attention to the transition phrases, like so, next, then, therefore, thus, for example, take the case where, in order to, however, in spite of this, for this reason, consequently, it follows that, etc. Right, so these are all phrases that are going to connect one sentence to the last, and connect one paragraph to the next. Although usually for a paragraph transition, you'll need a little more than just one of these phrases. And in a philosophy essay, you're going to be directing your reader along a path, and those are the ways in which you do it, right? So these are kind of little signposts. In the last rule, I was talking about big signposts, but these are the little signposts that connect together the ideas in each sentence. Something that I've noticed that students often don't know about philosophical writing, that maybe is worth mentioning. Maybe I'll write it out. You can use the I. You can use the first person. Okay. So, some students in high school were trained that in scientific writing and in formal academic writing, you cannot say, I'm going to argue such and such, or I will show such and such. You have to use the passive voice. So many high school students have actually been trained to say, it will be shown that, or it will be argued that. Don't do that. That's terrible writing. It's terrible writing. Use the first person. Say, I'm going to argue that. So another related corollary, maybe I'll write up a new rule when I post the handout at the end of the handout. But a corollary of this is try to avoid the passive voice. I guess it's not a corollary. It's a more general rule that leads very quickly to using the first person, right? So it's because one should avoid using the passive voice if possible. Of course, sometimes you need the passive voice. I'm not saying this isn't like a blanket prohibition. Again, you'll need to use your judgment. There are cases where you're going to need the passive voice, and in those cases, it's fine to use it. But if you're trying to avoid the passive voice, where the passive voice often comes up is in trying to avoid the first person. So don't try to avoid the first person. That's okay. If you were to pick up, Philosophical Review, a philosophy journal, you would see people talking about, I will do such and such, or we will see that, right? You'll see the first person all over the place. It's absolutely fine in philosophical writing. All right. So first person's okay. Try to avoid passive voice. Okay, let's. So coming back to the handout. Let me erase this. Here we go. So coming back to the handout, one thing to be careful about, and I see this all the time in philosophy papers, is don't make your point too strongly or too weakly, right? Be careful about the strength with which you make your point. So like, don't say, it'll be proved that X when it'll only be argued that X, right? So proof is stronger than argumentation. And you don't want to make the claim out to be stronger than it usually is. Or something I've also seen recently is people saying, well, it might be the case that, or one might say, X, when in fact they mean, X, right? And so they sort of hedge the claim, and when they hedge the claim, they actually weaken it such that it can no longer do the work that it needs to do in the argument, right? And if the claim is not strong enough to do the work that it needs to do in the argument doesn't work, right? The argument falls apart. The brick is made of mush, and the whole building falls down. So be careful with strong phrases like certainly, surely, obviously, or all, or every, or always. In those cases, if what you're saying, if you're putting your point too strongly, then it'll be easy to refute your point, or easy to see why what you're saying couldn't be that strong, right? But also be careful with weak phrases, because if you put something in too weak of a way, like it may be the case that one might say, it's my personal opinion. Ooh, typo. It's my personal opinion. I wonder how the D got in there. So if you put things that way too weakly, then well, then you're not going to be able to make the argument effectively, right? If what you mean is it is the case that, then you only say it may be the case, well, then you're not going to be able to argue on the basis of its being the case that, right? And so that's not going to work. So be careful. You're going to have to use your judgment about the strength of your claims, and you neither want them to be too weak nor too strong. Okay. Rule number 7: defend your thesis. Right. So to do this for the essays in this class, you have to reconstruct the reasoning in question. So in order to do that, right, so now we're zooming out here, and now we're moving to the broader paper as a whole. And in the broader paper as a whole, right, first, you're usually going to be presenting the relevant background, and this might include giving context for the argument you're going to be focusing on, or defining your terms. But note, sometimes defining your terms or giving the relevant context can be more effectively done later in the paper, right? Maybe your author is, maybe you think, well, my reader isn't quite ready to hear about the distinction between thinking and extension. In my second paragraph introducing substances and actions, maybe it would be more effective to introduce that topic, that distinction, later in the paper when I'm turning to Descartes, for whom that distinction is very important, for example. So sometimes giving that context or defining your terms shouldn't be done at the outset. It should be done later in the paper, and that's going to just depend on the topic that you're working through. So again, you're going to have to use your own judgment. Second, break down each step in the main argument into paragraph-sized parts. So outline your paper. I mean, ideally, right? You'll have an outline before you start really writing, and that outline will break the topic down into paragraph-sized parts. Here, let's flip the page. And those will usually themselves be giving smaller arguments or explaining the relevant conceptual machinery. So again, this sort of goes back to the method for writing a philosophy paper that we discussed in the prior video. So, each sentence should be contributing to the overall argument of the paragraph, and the paragraph should be fitting together into a cohesive whole. And so when this is done right, you should feel like each piece of the argument fits together with the last smoothly and comfortably, almost like you're building a piece of furniture, right? Like you're following, you know, when I read the paper, I should feel like I'm reading IKEA instructions, and you know, I'm being led along where it's like, you know, maybe very clear IKEA instructions, right? I mean, sometimes IKEA instructions aren't the best instructions, but I should feel like at each step in building my piece of furniture, I know exactly what I should be doing in that construction. And in the same way, I want to be constructing a piece of reasoning where at each step, I understand what I should be doing at that point in constructing the argument. You can also think of it like working out a multi-step math problem. I mean, if you've done problem sets, or if you've done proofs in geometry or in logic, especially more advanced logic, each thing you write is a step in the proof, and the same should be true in these philosophy papers, right? In a philosophy paper, by the end, right, at each stage in the argument, you should be leading me along a path, a strat of instructions in constructing a whole piece of reasoning that inexorably leads me to your conclusion, right? So what I want to see out of your papers is that that you've inexorably carried me to your conclusion. Okay. Rule number 8: avoid merely reporting what the author that you're talking about believes, or avoid giving quotes without any explanation. That's not to say that you shouldn't be using quotes or paraphrasing the authors that you're talking about. You should. I expect that, and if you're not quoting and not referring to the authors, there's a big problem. So you should be quoting, and you should be paraphrasing, and you should be giving references for where you're getting the reasoning in the text, from Aristotle, Descartes, or Hume, or whatever, right? But you are reconstructing the reasoning that's brought Aristotle, Descartes, or Hume to the relevant conclusion, and you are carrying yourself and me, the reader, through this reasoning. Thus, you always need to be making clear why we should believe the thing that you're reporting the author believes, right? So you should be justifying your claims at each stage and showing that you understand what the reasoning behind the claim, right? So anytime you give a quote, you should explain why the author that you're quoting believes that thing is true. If you don't have the explanation why, then it's then you haven't made the argument, right? So you should always be explaining how you understand the quotes that you're giving. I mean, you can't just give a quote and then move on. You've got to make it clear how you understand the quote and why the author who you're quoting believes that it's true. What justifies that claim? So avoid merely reporting, but do use quotes and paraphrases. Okay. Section 9, always cite your sources. Every time you're relying on the ideas of somebody else, you need to cite them. Book titles should be in italics, article titles in quotation marks. But when you're actually giving the citations in the text, obviously, you use quotation marks, right? So the things that you're citing, so if you want to refer to a text, right, give a footnote with the full bibliographical information, and at the end of the note, if you'll be citing that thing a lot, you can say in the future citation in text, and then later, you know, when you're writing, say, about Descartes, you give a quote, and then you say ... Meditations, page 51, or whatever, right? And so so in those footnotes, when you're giving the bibliographical information, book titles in italics, article titles, quotation marks, period, commas, and the interrogative and the bang go inside quotation marks. The colon, semicolon go outside of quotation marks. All right. Rule number 10, draft your work. So never turn in unedited work and start drafting early. So you're going to want to, I mean, I said this in the last essay, but the difference between an A paper and a B paper is whether you've edited. So I expect you to have proofread your own essay. And the difference between a B and a C is whether you proofread your essay and edit it. And you want to edit you don't just want to proofread it, but you want to edit for completeness. You want to make sure that you do all that you claim to do, and all that you need to do if you're setting your own topic, right? You want to make sure that there's no holes, there's no gaps, that when your reader reads through, they're not like, well, what about this, right? Where it's clear that you should have addressed this. And again, that takes judgment, right? You have to learn how to see what your reader is going to think, well, what about this, where they think you really should have addressed that, right? You're going to have to be able to separate that from the, well, what about this, where they don't think you really should have addressed that, right? I mean, in a way, in professional philosophical writing, that's the core skill. Philosophical readers are always going to be thinking of objections and thinking, well, what about this? And the difference between a good paper and a bad paper is not that it gets objections or not. Rather, it's that when it gets objections, the ones that are the objections that should have been dealt with are dealt with, and the ones that needn't to have been dealt with aren't dealt with, right? Like, that's the fine art of writing a philosophy paper, is dealing with the objections you need to deal with and not dealing with the objections you don't need to deal with. So edit for completeness. Make sure you do all that you claim to do or all that you need to do. Edit for clarity. Reread your paper, read and reread your paper out loud. Like I said, I obsessively reread my paper out loud. I use a text-to-speech program to read everything, and I have that text-to-speech program read my own papers out loud, my own writing out loud to me. I think this is an amazing way to edit. And I catch all sorts of things that people who just read silently to themselves don't catch, because it does, different things pop out when it's out loud. And that said, I mean, I miss like capital letters or homonyms, because when you read it out loud, it's not something that's caught. It's not something that's evident, right? So read over and edit the draft at least once a day, ideally for a week, right? And if you do that, your paper will get much better. And maybe some days you don't spend that much time reading and editing, or maybe you get to a point where you think, no, this is solid. And if your papers reach that point, that's a very good sign. But if you don't have a chance to proofread, don't expect to get an A on the paper. Often that's very difficult. Maybe in an intro class you can, but especially in more advanced classes, getting an A without proofreading your paper and writing it ahead of time becomes very difficult. Okay, a few final little things. So I found that students often don't quite know how to use the colon or semicolon. So a colon, here's an example. Here's the problem with the view, colon. It can't explain blah, 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 or Jane said blah, blah, blah. So anything with the sense of the following, you want to use a colon, right? So a colon is going to introduce a list of things, whereas a semicolon, you know, here's another example. This sentence is dumb, however, it's illustrative. So semicolons are used when two sentences are contributing to expressing the same idea, but they're distinct sentences, right? So they could stand alone. You could put a period there, but because the sentences are contributing to the same idea, they're being separated by a semicolon. So they're included in the same sentence, even though they're distinct sentences. Okay, formatting, numbers on the bottom of the page, Times New Roman, 12-point font, double space, normal, 1-inch margins. You guys have been doing pretty well at that. And remember, always anonymize. If your name is on one of the major papers, then it's going to cost you a letter grade. Okay, that I hope will help you in writing your papers. I will post some common mistakes that I saw on the first essays. don't remember if I posted this already. Often I do post it earlier. But that'll give you some common misconceptions. I'm not going to make a video for that or read through it. Okay, hope that's helpful.